What if the most powerful being on Earth simply didn't care? Not because he was evil, not because he was broken, but because he had already fought every battle worth fighting, and none of it, not a single moment, had ever made him feel anything at all. The Avengers were assembling. The sky was tearing apart, and Saitama was checking if the store had his favorite brand of udon noodles. This is not the story of a hero who saved the world. This is the story of what happens when the strongest man alive decides that your apocalypse is simply not his problem, and what that silence costs every single person on this planet. If you've ever wondered what would actually happen if One Punch Man existed in the Marvel Universe and just didn't show up, then you need to stay right here, because what unfolds in this story is something no comic, no movie, and no crossover event has ever dared to explore. We're talking about the Avengers on their knees, Thor questioning his own existence, and a villain so powerful that even Iron Man's last suit couldn't scratch him, all while Saitama stood in aisle 7, debating between two flavors of instant ramen. Subscribe, hit the bell, and do not skip a single second of this, because the moment you think you know where this is going, this story will punch you in a direction you never expected. There is a version of Earth that looks almost exactly like ours, same cities, same skylines, same fragile sense of normalcy that humans cling to even when the universe keeps proving, over and over again, that normalcy is just the name we give to the time between disasters. In this version of Earth, the Avengers exist. Tony Stark built his armor in a cave and never stopped building. Steve Rogers woke up from the ice and never stopped running. Thor came down from Asgard and decided, somewhat reluctantly, that humanity was worth protecting. And all of them, every single one, had spent years carrying the weight of a world that never asked them to carry it but always needed them to. They were Earth's mightiest heroes, and for a long time that meant something. But this version of Earth has something the original doesn't. Something that arrived quietly, without announcement, without drama, without so much as a classified SHIELD report. Because the sensors that tracked gamma radiation and cosmic anomalies and Asgardian energy signatures had absolutely no category for what Saitama was. He didn't register as a threat. He didn't register as an anomaly. He barely registered at all, which was, in a way, the most accurate reading any machine had ever produced about him, because Saitama himself had long since stopped registering as much of anything either. He had moved to this version of New York not because he wanted to, but because the apartment was cheap, the commute to the Hero registration office was straightforward, and the grocery store 2 blocks down had a loyalty card program that gave him a free item every 10th visit. He was, by every official metric of the Hero Association's cross-dimensional registry, a Class B hero, not because he lacked the power to be ranked higher, but because he hadn't filled out the paperwork for his last 3 S-Class evaluation requests, and the association had eventually stopped sending reminders. Genos had tried, multiple times, to handle the bureaucratic escalation on his behalf, but Saitama had told him, with the calm certainty of a man who has genuinely stopped caring about how the world perceives him, that the rank didn't change the groceries. And so he existed in this world the way a mountain exists in a city, massive, immovable, utterly indifferent to the traffic flowing around its base, present in a way that is impossible to ignore, and yet somehow, consistently, ignored anyway. The neighbors knew him as the bald guy in apartment 4C who sometimes came home with dents in the pavement around him and never seemed to have a scratch on his suit. The corner store owner knew him as the customer who bought the most instant noodles per capita of any single human being in the tri-state area. And the Avengers, Earth's mightiest heroes, the people who had fought gods and aliens and the very concept of time itself, didn't know he existed at all. This is where the story begins. Not with a battle, not with an explosion, not with the kind of inciting incident that screenwriters love and audiences have been trained to recognize, but with a Tuesday. A perfectly ordinary Tuesday in which the sky above New York City began to do something that skis are not supposed to do, which is split open along a seam of crackling violet energy that stretched from the Hudson River to somewhere above Queens. And through that seam came a being that had not visited this dimension in 11,000 years, and had spent every single one of those years getting angrier. His name, in the language of the dimension he came from, translated roughly to the one who unmakes. But the Avengers, when their sensors lit up like a Christmas tree designed by someone who hated Christmas, would later refer to him in their reports as Valdris, because their dimensional linguistics specialist was on vacation, and someone had to name the thing before the briefing started. Valdris was, by every measurable standard available to Tony Stark's most sophisticated analytical systems, the most powerful entity that had ever set foot on Earth. He was older than the Asgardian pantheon. He had survived the collapse of 3 separate universes. He had, at some point in his 11,000-year absence, apparently decided that Earth specifically had something he wanted, and he had come to take it with the kind of calm, absolute confidence that only comes from never having met anything that could stop you. The readings that came in during the first 4 minutes of his arrival were, according to Friday, Tony's AI, statistically inconsistent with anything in our existing threat database, which means we're either looking at a calibration error or we're looking at something we've never seen before. And given the current visual data, I'm going to recommend we assume it's the second one. Tony was already in the suit before she finished the sentence. Steve was pulling on the shield. Thor was reaching for Mjolnir with an expression that people who knew him well would recognize as the expression he wore when he was genuinely, deeply concerned. Not the performed concern of a man playing the role of a warrior, but the real thing, the kind that settled into the lines around his eyes when he understood in his bones that this was going to be different. And 11 blocks away, in the grocery store on the corner of West 43rd and 9th, Saitama was standing in the cereal aisle, holding 2 boxes of the same brand in different sizes, doing the per ounce math in his head because he had left his phone at home and couldn't use the calculator. The store's fluorescent lights flickered once when the dimensional rift opened. The manager came on the intercom to say that customers should remain calm and that the store would be closing early due to an emergency in the area. Saitama looked up at the light, looked back at the cereal boxes, determined that the larger box was technically the better value, but that he wouldn't be able to finish it before it went stale, and put it back on the shelf. He took the smaller box, tucked it under his arm, and walked toward the checkout lane, because the self-checkout was broken, and the line at Register 3 looked shorter than Register 5, even though Register 5 had a faster cashier. A calculation he had made based on 6 months of personal observation. Outside, the sky was falling apart. Inside aisle 7, Saitama was deciding whether the 2-for-1 deal on canned salmon was worth it given that he already had 3 cans at home. The apocalypse and the arithmetic existed simultaneously, in the same city, in the same moment, and only one of them was going to make Saitama late for dinner. This is not a story about a hero who rises to the occasion. This is a story about what the occasion looks like when the most powerful hero alive has decided that the occasion is not his to rise to, and what it costs the world that he made that decision on a Tuesday in a grocery store over a box of cereal that was, objectively, a fine value for the price. The thing about the Avengers that most people never fully appreciated, not the ones who cheered for them from the ground, not the politicians who argued about the Sokovia Accords in climate-controlled conference rooms, not even the journalists who had built entire careers out of analyzing their every move, was that their greatest strength had never been their powers. It had never been the armor or the shield or the hammer or the serum. Their greatest strength was the fact that they kept going. No matter what was in front of them, no matter how many times the math said they should lose, they kept moving forward, kept adapting, kept finding some angle, some gap, some impossibly narrow margin through which a plan could work if everything went exactly right, and a few things went slightly better than that. That stubbornness, that refusal to accept the ceiling that reality kept trying to place over them, was what had saved the world every single time before. It was also, on this particular Tuesday, the thing that was going to get several of them hurt very badly before the hour was over. Tony reached Valdris first, because Tony always reached the threat first. It was a compulsion he had long since stopped trying to analyze and simply accepted as part of his operational software. The part that said if something is dangerous and no one else is there yet, you go, you stall. You buy time. You be the thing between the danger and everyone else until the everyone else arrives. He came in fast, repulsors already charging, Friday feeding him targeting data that was, she admitted in the same breath she delivered it, almost entirely speculative because the entity's energy signature kept shifting in ways that didn't correspond to any known physics. Tony processed this information, filed it in the part of his brain labeled problems to solve while fighting, and opened with a full repulsor blast aimed at center mass. Valdris turned his head. Not his body, just his head, the way you might turn to look at a sound you weren't expecting, the kind of mild, unhurried attention you give to something that has surprised you slightly without alarming you at all. The repulsor blast hit him somewhere in the vicinity of his left shoulder and dispersed across his surface like water hitting a warm skillet. Not absorbed, not deflected, just rendered irrelevant by the simple fact that the thing it was hitting had no meaningful relationship with the kind of energy Tony was using. Friday's sensors registered the impact as having approximately the same effect on Valdris as a strong breeze, and she reported this to Tony in the careful, measured tone she used when the news was bad, and she was trying to deliver it without triggering a panic response. Tony's response, delivered through clenched teeth at approximately 400 miles per hour as he banked hard to avoid the return gesture. A single, almost lazy wave of Valdris's hand that produced a shockwave capable of flattening 3 city blocks, was a single word that Friday chose not to log in the official mission report. Thor arrived 11 seconds later, coming in from altitude with Mjolnir trailing lightning that turned the afternoon sky white, and he hit Valdris with the kind of strike that had ended the destroyer, had cracked the Rainbow Bridge, had punctuated the conclusion of more battles than Thor had bothered to count across his very long and very violent life. It was a blow delivered with full Asgardian force, with the weight of a god who had decided that this thing needed to stop, and it connected cleanly, squarely, with the kind of solid, undeniable impact that Thor's body knew meant something significant had just happened. Valdris stumbled back half a step, one single half step, on a being that stood roughly 14 feet tall, which meant his center of mass had shifted perhaps 8 inches from where it had been before Thor hit him with the accumulated force of a thunderstorm compressed into a single point of contact. Thor, to his credit, recognized immediately what that half step meant, because Thor had been in enough fights across enough worlds to understand the language of physical response, to know the difference between something reacting to damage and something acknowledging, with mild interest, that contact had occurred. He landed, turned to face Valdris fully, and tightened his grip on Mjolnir in the way he did when he was preparing for something longer and harder than he had initially planned for. Steve arrived on the ground level, shield already moving, because Steve's role in the opening phase of any engagement was to be present, to be visible, to be the thing that drew attention and created angles for everyone else to work with. He was also running calculations, not the kind Tony ran, not digital and precise, but the older kind, the kind built from years of reading battlefields and bodies and the geometry of violence, the kind that told him where people were going to be and what they were going to do before they did it. What his calculations were telling him right now, as he watched Thor's full-force strike produce half a step of movement in something that hadn't even fully turned to face them yet, was that they were going to need a different approach, and they were going to need it quickly, before the thing they were facing decided to stop being patient with them. Because that was the other thing about Valdris that none of their briefings had prepared them for. The thing that Friday's sensor data couldn't quantify and that no threat database had a category for. He was patient. Not in the way that dangerous things are sometimes patient, bidding their time, waiting for an opening. Patient in the way that things are patient when they are not worried. Patient in the way that someone stands and watches a child try to open a jar that is too tight for them. Not unkind, not cruel, simply present in the knowledge that the jar is not going to open until they choose to help. He was watching the Avengers with something that, if you were being generous, you might call curiosity, and if you were being honest, you would call the mild interest of something that had seen this exact sequence of events play out on enough worlds to know exactly how it ended. Natasha, coordinating from a position 3 buildings back where she had the best available sight lines, was already on comms with the helicarrier, already requesting everything SHIELD had on dimensional entities of this classification, already aware that the answer was going to be not enough, because the answer was always not enough. When things came through rifts in the sky, and the initial engagement data looked like this. She was also, with the other half of her mind, doing what she always did in the opening minutes of a fight she didn't understand yet. Cataloging, nodding, filing away every detail she could observe about how Valdris moved and responded and stood, because information was the only weapon she had in this particular moment, and she intended to use it. What she observed in those first critical minutes was this: Valdris was not fighting the Avengers. He was tolerating them. There was a difference, and it was a difference that mattered enormously, because it meant that everything they threw at him, every blast, every strike, every tactically coordinated angle of attack that Steve was trying to organize on the fly, was not being countered or defeated. It was being endured, the way you endure rain when you're outside and the rain is unpleasant, but you have somewhere to be and you're going to get there regardless. He had a destination, a purpose, something he had come to this dimension to do, and the Avengers were not between him and that purpose. They were beside it, adjacent to it, a minor inconvenience in the periphery of an agenda that had been 11,000 years in the making, and was not going to be meaningfully disrupted by a man in a metal suit and his very determined friends. Bruce Banner, watching the sensor feeds from the Quinjet holding pattern 2 miles out, said very quietly to the pilot next to him that he was going to need a few minutes to think, and the pilot, who had been with SHIELD long enough to know what Bruce Banner thinking quietly before a mission usually meant, nodded and said nothing, and kept the jet in its holding pattern and waited. Bruce was looking at the energy readings from Valdris, specifically at the pattern of energy distribution across his form, the way it moved and shifted and reorganized itself in the milliseconds after each impact. And he was thinking about something he had read in a theoretical physics paper 3 years ago that he had filed away in the back of his mind as interesting but irrelevant, because at the time, there had been no practical context for it. He was beginning to understand that the context had arrived, and that the paper's central thesis, which was that certain classes of multidimensional entities did not experience physical force the way matter in a single dimension did, because they existed partially outside the dimension they were currently occupying, meaning that impacts registered as pressure rather than damage was not theoretical anymore. He picked up his comm and said, "Tony, I need you to listen to me for 30 seconds." And Tony, who was currently executing a series of evasive maneuvers at approximately 300 miles per hour while simultaneously running 17 different analyses on Valdris's surface composition, said, "20, Banner, make it 20." And Bruce said, "Fine, 20," and told him what he had figured out. Tony went quiet, not the busy quiet of a man processing new information and reorganizing his tactical approach. The other kind of quiet, the kind that Tony Stark almost never went, the kind that meant the new information didn't have a tactical response available yet. Friday noted the silence, cross-referenced it against Tony's biometric data, and flagged it internally as a situation requiring monitoring, because Tony Stark going quiet during an active engagement was not a data point that appeared anywhere in her operational history, and new data points of that kind were, in her experience, significant. 13 blocks away, in his apartment now, having finished his shopping and made the executive decision that the canned salmon was not worth it at full price but would be worth it if it went on sale in the next 2 weeks, Saitama was sitting on his floor in front of his television, eating the udon noodles he had bought, because yes, they had his brand, which was the minor victory of the afternoon, and watching a cooking competition show that he had been following for 3 weeks. The show was currently in its semi-final round, and the contestant he had been quietly supporting, a quiet man from Osaka who made very good broth, was competing against someone who was technically more skilled but less focused on the fundamentals, and Saitama had opinions about this. The news ticker at the bottom of the screen mentioned, in small white letters on a red background, that there was an ongoing emergency in Midtown Manhattan involving an unclassified entity and that residents were advised to evacuate the area. Saitama's eyes moved to the ticker, read it, moved back to the cooking competition. The man from Osaka had just received his judge's feedback on his broth, and the head judge had used the word transcendent, which Saitama felt was appropriate. He slurped his noodles. Outside, 11 blocks away, the sky above New York City was actively being dismantled by something that had survived the death of 3 universes, and the people tasked with stopping it were beginning to understand, with increasing clarity, that they might not be able to. Saitama reached for the remote to turn up the volume because the upstairs neighbor had chosen this particular moment to start moving furniture, and the scraping was making it hard to hear the judge's comments. He turned it up 3 notches. The cooking show continued. The battle outside continued. And the distance between those 2 realities, 11 blocks, approximately a 4-minute walk at a normal pace, less than 2 seconds at the speed Saitama moved when he was in a hurry, which he was not, remained exactly as vast as Saitama's complete and total indifference made it. There is a particular kind of desperation that only arrives after competence has been fully exhausted. After every plan has been tried, every option has been burned through, every person in the room who is supposed to have an answer has looked at the problem and looked at each other and arrived, simultaneously, at the silent acknowledgement that the answers have run out. It is a different feeling from panic, which is loud and reactive and still contains within it the energy of someone who believes that moving fast enough might change the outcome. This desperation is quieter. It settles. It sits in the chest like something heavy and waits, while the mind catches up to what the body already knows, which is that the situation has moved beyond the boundary of what skill and preparation and willpower can address, and that something else is needed, something outside the existing framework, something that wasn't in the original plan, because the original plan was built by people who didn't know this kind of problem was possible. Tony Stark reached that place 43 minutes into the engagement, and he reached it the way he reached most difficult truths, not gradually, not through a process of slow acceptance, but all at once, like a system update completing and rebooting with new parameters. He was hovering above the intersection of 44th and 8th, his suit running at 62% capacity after absorbing 3 separate shockwave impacts, Friday's damage assessment scrolling across his HUD in a font size she had made slightly larger than usual, because she had noticed that he was having trouble focusing on small text when his adrenaline levels were at their current elevation. The assessment was not encouraging. The suit could sustain approximately another 11 minutes of this level of engagement before the structural integrity of the primary chassis became a genuine concern. Thor had been knocked into the Hudson River twice and come back both times, which was impressive and also, from a tactical standpoint, not meaningfully changing the situation. Steve had managed to coordinate a 3-angle simultaneous strike that had produced, according to Friday's analysis, the most significant response they had yet achieved from Valdris. He had turned fully to face them, which meant they had graduated from being a peripheral annoyance to being something that had earned his direct attention, and Tony was genuinely unsure whether that was progress or the opposite of progress. Bruce had not transformed. He was still in the Quinjet, still thinking, still working through the theoretical framework he had identified, because Bruce's relationship with the other guy was complicated in ways that no amount of therapy had fully resolved, and he had learned, over years of difficult experience, that sending the Hulk into a situation where the Hulk's primary contribution would be to hit something very hard, and the something very hard would not be meaningfully affected by being hit, was not a good reason to have the conversation with himself that transforming always required. He was instead doing the thing that Bruce Banner was actually best at, which was understanding problems at a level deep enough to find the edge cases, the exceptions, the narrow possibilities that existed in the gap between what the rules said should happen and what was actually happening. He had been on the comm with Tony 3 times in the last 20 minutes, each time refining the picture slightly, each time arriving at the same central conclusion from a slightly different angle, which was that Valdris could not be defeated by any force that existed entirely within this dimension, because the part of him that processed damage was not located in this dimension, and hitting the part of him that was here was roughly equivalent to trying to injure someone by damaging their shadow. It was Natasha who said it first, because Natasha had always been the one willing to say the thing that no one else wanted to say, the thing that lived at the end of the logical chain that everyone had been following but no one had wanted to arrive at. She said it on the team channel, in the same calm, level tone she used for everything, the tone that had no register for panic because she had trained the panic out of herself so thoroughly and so long ago that its absence was no longer something she thought about. She said, "We need to find whatever is in this city that's stronger than what we're fighting, because we are not that thing." There was a silence on the channel that lasted approximately 4 seconds, which in the context of an active battle was a very long silence, and then Tony said, "Friday, pull everything we have on enhanced individuals currently registered or flagged in the New York metropolitan area." And Friday said, "Already running it," because she had been running it for the last 12 minutes, having reached the same conclusion via a different route. And she had been waiting for Tony to ask, because she had learned that Tony processed better when he felt like he was driving the inquiry rather than receiving it. The list was not long. Most of the significant enhanced presences in New York were currently in the field, which was the team Tony was already working with, minus the ones who were unavailable for reasons ranging from currently off-planet to currently in a legal dispute with the federal government that precluded active deployment. There were several individuals on the secondary registry, people with abilities that had been noted and filed and categorized at various threat and asset levels, and Friday went through them efficiently, cross-referencing their last known locations and their documented capability profiles against the current situation, filtering out the ones whose abilities were irrelevant and the ones whose last known locations put them outside practical reach. And then she reached the entry for apartment 4C at a building on West 43rd, and she stopped, because the entry for apartment 4C was one of the strangest files in the SHIELD database, and not because of what it contained, but because of what it didn't contain, which was any meaningful upper limit on the capability profile of the individual registered there. Most files of this type had numbers, power output measurements, force calculations, energy readings, the quantified language of assessment that gave analysts something to work with when they were trying to understand what they were dealing with. The file for the individual in apartment 4C had a note in the assessment field that said, simply, "Measurement equipment non-applicable. No ceiling established. Recommend further study." It had been written by a junior analyst 14 months ago, after a routine sweep of enhanced individual registrations, had turned up a series of incident reports from the Hell's Kitchen area that described property damage, consistent with impacts of force levels, that the analyst's instrumentation couldn't account for, and the individual associated with those reports had, when contacted for a voluntary assessment, shown up to the SHIELD facility in a yellow jumpsuit and cape, eaten 3 of the granola bars from the waiting room, been entirely cooperative with every test they ran, broken every piece of equipment they used to run those tests without appearing to exert any effort whatsoever, and then asked if he could leave early because there was a sale at the grocery store that ended at 6. Friday flagged the file. Tony read it. He read it again. He read the note about the measurement equipment. He read the part about the granola bars. He said, "What is this?" And Friday said, "The most complete picture I have of a registered individual whose documented capabilities appear to exceed anything else currently in our database by a margin I cannot calculate because the upper end of the margin is not defined." And Tony said, "Where is he right now?" And Friday said, "Apartment 4C, West 43rd. Based on his last registered location, and the fact that his movement has not triggered any of our area sensors in the last 2 hours, which means he either hasn't left his building or he moves in a way that our sensors don't register." And Tony said, with the tone of a man who was very tired and very out of options and very aware of both those things, "Get me a line to that apartment." Saitama's phone rang 4 times before he picked it up, because the cooking show was in its final judging segment, and the man from Osaka had just presented his completed dish, and the judges were deliberating, and Saitama wanted to hear the result before he engaged with whatever this was. He picked up on the 5th ring, said, "Yeah," and heard on the other end the voice of Tony Stark, which meant nothing to him specifically, because Saitama did not follow news coverage of the Avengers with any particular attention, but which carried in it the specific frequency of a very intelligent person who was used to being the most capable individual in any given situation, and was currently not that saying, "Is this the individual registered at this address with the Hero Association Secondary Registry, Class B designation, cape and yellow suit?" Saitama said, "Yeah, that's me." He was watching the judges on his television. The head judge had just picked up his chopsticks. Tony said, "We have a situation in Midtown that is outside our current operational capacity, and your file indicates you may have capabilities relevant to addressing it. We need your help." The head judge tasted the broth. His eyes closed for a moment. He set down his chopsticks and looked at the man from Osaka with an expression that Saitama recognized as genuine appreciation from a person who had tasted a great many things and knew the difference between good and extraordinary. Saitama said, "I'm kind of in the middle of something." There was a pause on Tony's end that Friday would later describe in her logs as consistent with the processing delay, observed when the subject encounters information that does not map to existing predictive models. Then Tony said, "There is an 11,000-year-old extra-dimensional entity currently dismantling the infrastructure of Lower Manhattan, and we have been engaging it for 43 minutes without producing any meaningful change in its operational status, and your file says you might be the only thing in this city capable of changing that. So I need to know, what are you in the middle of that is more pressing than that?" Saitama said, "Cooking show. The guy I've been rooting for is about to find out if he won." Another pause, longer this time. Tony said, "Did he win?" And Saitama, watching the head judge stand up from his seat to begin the announcement, said, "Hang on." He watched. The head judge spoke. The man from Osaka looked at the floor for a moment, then looked up, and his expression was the expression of someone who had worked very hard at something for a very long time and had just been told that it was enough. Saitama felt something that wasn't quite happiness but was in the same neighborhood, the satisfaction of a thing resolving correctly, of the outcome matching what it should have been. He said, "Yeah, he won. Okay, what did you need?" Tony, who had spent the last 43 minutes fighting for his life against something that had survived 3 universal collapses, said, "Can you come to Midtown?" And Saitama said, "Is it urgent?" And Tony said, in a voice that had run completely out of the register where irony lives and was operating purely on the raw material of a man who needed something and was asking for it as directly as he knew how, "Yes, it is extremely urgent." Saitama looked at the time. He looked at the window through which, if he leaned slightly to the left, he could see the edge of the glow that Valdris's presence was casting on the sky above Midtown, the violet-white shimmer that had been there for the last 40-something minutes, visible from his window the entire time he had been watching the cooking show, noted and filed and not acted upon because it had not been his shift. There had been no alert and nobody had called. Until now. Somebody had called. He said, "Give me a few minutes," and Tony said, "We may not have a few minutes," and Saitama said, "Okay, a few minutes," and hung up, because he needed to put his noodle bowl in the sink and find his shoes, and those were tasks that required a small amount of time regardless of what was happening in Midtown, because Saitama had learned a long time ago that going into a fight without your shoes was a choice you regretted, and also that the sink didn't rinse itself. Thor, who had been listening to the comm exchange on the shared channel from his position in the air above 46th Street, said nothing for a moment, and then said, to no one in particular, "That man just made Tony Stark wait while watching a cooking program." And Steve, who was crouched behind an overturned city bus and reassessing the tactical situation, said, "I heard." And Thor said, "I find that either deeply concerning or deeply reassuring, and I cannot yet determine which." And Steve said, "Me neither," and they both watched the building on West 43rd and waited for the door to open. The door to the building on West 43rd opened 4 minutes and 17 seconds after Saitama hung up the phone, which Tony's internal clock registered with the particular precision of a man who had been tracking every second of the last 47 minutes, with the awareness that each second had a cost attached to it. A cost measured in structural damage, in civilian displacement, in the incremental degradation of his suit's capacity to keep him alive and functional, and in the slow, grinding erosion of the tactical margin that had been thin to begin with and was now approaching a thickness that could be measured in single digits. 4 minutes and 17 seconds was, by any reasonable standard of emergency response time, an eternity. It was also, Tony noted with the part of his brain that never fully stopped observing even when the rest of him was occupied with surviving, exactly the amount of time it would take a person to walk from the 4th floor of that building to the ground floor exit at a completely normal, unhurried pace, which meant that the individual who had just emerged from the door had not run, had not taken the stairs 2 at a time, had not done any of the things that a person does when they understand that they are urgently needed somewhere. He had walked, at the pace of someone going to check the mail. Saitama stood on the sidewalk outside his building and looked toward Midtown with the expression that was, by this point in his life, his default expression for most things. The expression that his face had settled into somewhere around the 2-year mark of his hero career, when the last thing that had been capable of surprising him had failed to surprise him, and his face had decided, apparently permanently, that the appropriate response to the world was a kind of mild, attentive blankness that communicated nothing except the fact that he was present and paying a moderate amount of attention. He was wearing his hero suit, the yellow jumpsuit, the white cape, the boots that he had needed those 4 minutes to locate because one of them had ended up under the couch at some point in the previous week, and he had only remembered this when he went to put it on. He looked at the sky above Midtown, at the violet-white shimmer that was now, up close and without the mediation of a window and a cooking show, considerably more dramatic than it had appeared from his apartment. Buildings were missing sections. There was a crater in the street visible from where he was standing that had not been there this morning when he walked to the grocery store. The air had a particular quality to it, a pressure, a charge, the feeling of something very large and very powerful existing nearby, and not being particularly concerned about the effect of its existence on the surrounding environment. Saitama looked at it all with his default expression, put his hands in his pockets, and started walking toward it. Not running, walking, at a pace that suggested he was heading somewhere specific but not urgently, the pace of a man going to meet someone for lunch who had left with enough time that rushing wasn't necessary. Tony, watching from above, processed this for a moment and then said on the private channel to Friday, "Is he walking?" And Friday said, "Yes." And Tony said, "Tell me he's going to speed up." And Friday said, "His pace has been consistent since he exited the building and shows no indication of acceleration." And Tony said something that Friday again chose not to log. Steve watched Saitama walk and felt something that he spent a moment trying to identify before recognizing it as the particular cognitive dissonance of a situation in which every available data point is sending contradictory signals. The file said this person was beyond measurement. The walking said this person was not treating the situation with the urgency the situation appeared to require. These two things could both be true simultaneously. Steve had enough experience with genuinely powerful people to know that confidence and urgency existed on an inverse relationship at a certain level of capability, that the people who moved fastest were often the ones with the most to prove, and that the ones who had nothing to prove moved at whatever pace they felt like. But holding both things in his mind at once was producing a kind of low-grade cognitive friction that he couldn't quite resolve. Meanwhile, Valdres had reached the intersection of 42nd and 7th, which put him approximately 6 blocks from where he had entered the dimension, and approximately 1 block from whatever it was he had come here to find or do or take. And the Avengers had shifted from attempting to stop him to attempting to slow him, which was a meaningful tactical concession, and one that Steve had made with clear eyes because slowing was achievable and stopping was not. And achievable things were more useful than correct things when the situation was live, and the margin was gone. Thor was hitting him from above on a rotation designed to maximize the frequency of impacts even if the impacts themselves weren't producing damage, because Thor had figured out that while Valdres wasn't being hurt by the strikes, he was being mildly redirected by them. Each impact shifted his trajectory by a degree or two, and if you applied enough of them consistently enough, you could accumulate those degree shifts into something that looked, from a distance, like influence over his movement. Even if it was less influence than you wanted and more effort than it should have required. Natasha had evacuated 3 city blocks on the ground level, coordinating with local emergency services with the efficiency of someone who had done this specific thing enough times that the protocol lived in her muscle memory rather than her conscious mind, which freed her conscious mind to keep working the problem. She had also, in the gaps between coordination calls, been pulling everything available on the Class B registered individual currently walking toward the engagement zone at a pace that suggested he might stop for a coffee on the way. And what she was finding was doing something unusual to her threat assessment process, which was usually clean and decisive and built on the reliable foundation of available evidence. The available evidence here was a collection of incident reports, a broken assessment file, and 3 separate eyewitness accounts from Hell's Kitchen residents who had described, in language that ranged from matter-of-fact to deeply shaken, watching a bald man in a yellow suit end situation that should not have been endable with a single punch that produced no sound, no visible energy release, and no physical effort beyond the extension of a fist. One account described the aftermath of such a punch as the thing just stopped existing in the way it had been existing, which was not a sentence that fit neatly into any standard threat category, and which Natasha had read 3 times before accepting that the witness had been doing their best to describe something accurately with language that was not designed for the experience. Saitama was now 4 blocks from Valdres. He had passed the first crater without looking at it, stepped around a section of collapsed awning without breaking stride, and paused briefly at the corner of 44th and 8th, not because anything had stopped him, but because the walk signal was red, And Saitama had a policy about crossing on red that he maintained with a consistency that had nothing to do with traffic safety, and everything to do with the fact that it was a rule. And he followed rules not because he feared consequences, but because rules were the architecture of the ordinary world, and the ordinary world was the one he lived in, the one he was trying to stay connected to, the one that he sometimes felt slipping away from him in ways he couldn't fully articulate but recognized as loss. Tony, observing this from above, said, "He stopped at a crosswalk," in the tone of a man reporting a fact that his brain was not fully integrating. Friday said, "Confirmed," and Tony said, "There is an 11,000-year-old entity 1 block from him and he is waiting for the walk signal," and Friday said, "Also confirmed," and Tony said nothing for a moment and then said, "Okay," in the particular way that meant he had decided to stop trying to apply his existing framework to this person and simply observe what happened next. What happened next was that the signal changed, and Saitama crossed with the light and continued walking, and Valdris, who had paused in his progression toward whatever his destination was, distracted momentarily by Thor landing another series of redirecting impacts, turned for the first time, and appeared to notice the figure approaching on the street below. Not with alarm, not with recognition. With the same mild interest he had shown to everything else in this dimension, the interest of something that had seen a great many things, and had learned to assess them quickly and accurately, and had not yet seen anything here that changed its fundamental understanding of the situation. He looked at Saitama. Saitama looked at him. The distance between them was approximately half a block. Tony and Thor and Steve and Natasha were all in various positions around the intersection, watching this exchange with the focused attention of people who understood that something significant was either about to happen or about to definitively not happen, and that the difference between those two outcomes was currently embodied in the expression on the face of a bald man in a yellow suit who had waited for a crosswalk signal 6 blocks from an interdimensional apocalypse. Saitama looked at Valdris for a moment with his default expression, and then he looked around at the damage, the craters, the missing building sections, the overturned vehicles, the general condition of several city blocks that had, this morning, been a functional part of a city, and were now an argument for comprehensive structural assessment before anyone tried to use them again. He looked at all of it with the slow, comprehensive attention of someone taking inventory. Then he looked back at Valdris, and something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, not in the way that expressions shift in movies when the hero realizes what must be done, and the music swells and the camera pushes in. Just a small shift, the kind that only changes the reading of a face if you're paying close attention, the kind that meant something internally had moved from one category to another. He had not been called on his shift. There had been no alert. He had been watching a cooking show and eating noodles, and the world had been ending 11 blocks away, and none of that had been his problem, technically, officially, by any definition that the hero association would have recognized as binding. But someone had called, and he had come. And now he was here, standing half a block from something that had been dismantling this city for the better part of an hour, while the people who were supposed to stop it had thrown everything they had at it and produced approximately nothing. And the city was still getting dismantled, and the people who were supposed to stop it were still trying, because that's what they did. They kept trying, even when the trying wasn't working, and something about that, about the sheer stubborn persistence of people who were clearly overmatched and hadn't stopped, had moved something in Saitama from one category to another. The category it had moved to was not urgency. It was not duty. It was not the complex, weighted sense of responsibility that drove Steve Rogers, or the controlled, channeled fear that drove Tony Stark, or the genuine love of humanity that drove Thor, even when humanity was at its most difficult to love. It was something simpler and harder to name, something in the vicinity of "this is annoying and someone should deal with it," combined with the faint, familiar whisper of something that might have been hope, the hope that maybe this one, This thing that had survived 3 universal collapses and shrugged off everything the Avengers had thrown at it. Maybe this one would be different. Maybe this one would require something. Maybe this one would make him feel the thing he had been trying to feel for so long that he had almost stopped trying. He reached up and adjusted his cape. He rolled one shoulder slightly, the way you do when you're preparing for something physical and you want to make sure the joint is loose. He looked at Valdris with the expression of a man who has decided, without drama and without ceremony, that he is going to do a thing, and started walking toward him again. Tony said very quietly on the private channel, "Friday, are you recording this?" And Friday said, "Everything," and Tony said, "Good," and watched. There is a moment in every fight that has ever mattered, where the atmosphere changes, where something in the air shifts in a way that the people present can feel before they can explain it. A change in pressure, in temperature, in the quality of the silence between sounds, that tells every instinct in every body that the situation has entered a new phase and that the rules of the previous phase no longer apply. Soldiers know this moment. Fighters know it. People who have spent enough time in dangerous places develop a sensitivity to it that operates below conscious thought, a biological alarm system that was old when language was new, that says something has changed, and the change is significant, and you should pay attention to it now. Tony Stark had felt it in the cave in Afghanistan. Steve Rogers had felt it on the beach at Normandy. Thor had felt it in more battles than he had names for, on more worlds than this solar system contained. Every one of them felt it, the moment Saitama stepped within 10 feet of Valdris and stopped walking. It wasn't anything Saitama did. He didn't power up. There was no energy release, no visible change in his physical presentation, no crackling aura or glowing eyes or any of the visual vocabulary that the Avengers had learned to associate with beings operating at significant power levels. He just stopped walking and stood there, and looked up at Valdris with the same default expression he had been wearing since he left his apartment, and the atmosphere changed anyway, the way it changes when something very large and very heavy is placed near something it could destroy without effort, and both things are, for a moment, simply present in the same space. Valdris, who had not meaningfully reacted to anything in the last 53 minutes, went still. Not the stillness of something preparing to act, the other kind. The stillness of something that has encountered new information and is processing it with an attention it has not given to anything else in this dimension. He looked down at Saitama. The size difference was significant. Valdris at 14 feet made Saitama look approximately like what a house cat looks like standing next to a draft horse, and the visual absurdity of the pairing was not lost on anyone observing it from a distance. Tony, hovering at approximately 70 feet of altitude, was running Friday's analysis on every variable she could measure, and what Friday was measuring in Valdris was something she had not recorded at any point in the previous 53 minutes, which was a change. Specifically, a deceleration of the energy cycling that had been constant since his arrival, the continuous reorganization of his dimensional presence that Bruce had identified as the mechanism by which he processed and dispersed physical impacts. It had slowed. Not stopped, not reversed, but slowed, in the way that a system slows when it redirects processing capacity toward a new input, when something has arrived that requires more of its attention than the background tasks it had been managing. Valdris said something. The sound of it was not quite language in any register the human ear was designed to process. It had the shape of language, the rhythm and cadence of something communicative, but it existed at frequencies that produced, in the people close enough to hear it, a sensation less like hearing and more like pressure, like the feeling of a very large bell being struck nearby, the sound arriving as vibration in the chest before it arrived as anything the ear could decode. Friday caught it and ran it through every translation matrix she had, including the Asgardian linguistic database that Thor had contributed to SHIELD systems 2 years ago, and produced a translation that she flagged as low confidence but directionally indicated as something in the range of "What are you?" or possibly "What manner of thing is this?" A question in either case, which was itself significant, because questions implied that the thing asking them did not already know the answer. And Valdres had not, in 53 minutes of engagement, demonstrated any uncertainty about anything. Saitama, who had not heard any of this analysis and would not have found it particularly relevant if he had, said, "Hey," in the flat, conversational tone he used for most interactions that didn't require anything more specific. He said it the way you say it when you've walked up to someone at a party who you need to talk to and haven't quite worked out yet what you're going to say after the initial greeting. Casual, unperformative. The single syllable of a person who is present and acknowledge the other presence without assigning it any particular weight. Thor, watching from above, said quietly, in Old Norse, a phrase that translated roughly to "This is either the bravest thing I have ever witnessed or the most oblivious." And given that Thor had witnessed a genuinely extraordinary range of both categories across his very long life, this was not a negligible assessment. What happened next happened in a sequence that, when Tony later reviewed Friday's recording frame by frame, would take several hours to fully analyze and several more to partially understand, because the events occupied a span of real time that was so compressed as to be, for practical purposes, instantaneous, and unpacking the instantaneous into its component moments required the kind of slow, careful attention that real time does not allow for. In real time, what the observers experienced was this. Valdres moved, not the slow, deliberate movement he had been making for the last 53 minutes, but fast, genuinely fast, the speed of something that had decided the assessment period was over and the response period had begun. And then there was a sound, and then Valdres was somewhere else. The sound was the part that none of them had a framework for. It was not an explosion, though it had some of the qualities of one. It was not a crack, though it had some of the qualities of that too. It was a sound that existed at the intersection of several categories, without belonging fully to any of them. A compression of air, a displacement of space, a concussive report that arrived in the body before it arrived in the ears, and then continued past the ears into something that felt almost like memory, like the echo of something enormous that had happened before any of them were born, and that this sound was somehow reminding them of. Friday's audio sensors registered it at a level that required her to immediately recalibrate, because the initial reading was outside the range her systems had been configured to handle, which meant the sound was louder and more energetically significant than anything she had previously recorded, and she had previously recorded quite a lot. Valdres was no longer at the intersection of 42nd and 7th. He was at approximately the corner of 34th and 10th, which was 8 blocks away, and he was not standing. He was in the process of decelerating through a trajectory that had originated at his previous position and was terminating at a parking structure on the far side of 10th Avenue, and the parking structure was not going to survive the termination with its structural integrity intact, which it did not. Collapsing around him in a cascade of concrete and steel that raised a cloud of dust visible from 40 blocks away. Saitama was standing where he had been standing. His right arm was extended. His fist was at the end of it. He had not moved from the position he had been in when Valdres moved toward him. His feet were in the same place. His posture was the same. The only thing that had changed was that his right arm was now extended instead of at his side, which meant that somewhere in the sequence of events that had taken Valdres from standing in front of him to embedded in a parking structure 8 blocks away, Saitama had thrown a punch, and the punch had made contact, and the contact had produced the sound. And the sound had produced all of the rest of it. He lowered his arm. He looked at his fist for a moment with an expression that the people watching could not immediately read, not satisfaction, not relief, not the complicated pride of someone who has done something difficult and knows it. Something more searching than any of those, something that was looking for a feeling and had not yet found it, the expression of someone who has reached into a drawer for something they needed and found the drawer empty. Tony was the first one to say anything, And what he said was, "Friday, what was the force output of that strike?" And Friday said, "I don't have a clean number. My sensors were saturated at the moment of impact, and I lost approximately 0.3 seconds of clean data in the vicinity of the strike. What I can tell you is that the kinetic transfer was sufficient to move a 14-foot entity of Valdris's established mass and density 8 city blocks in under a second, which gives me a floor for the calculation but no ceiling, because I don't know how much of the force output the impact itself, absorbed versus transferred." Tony processed this and said, "Give me the floor," and Friday said, "The floor is a number I'm not comfortable saying out loud on an open channel." And Tony said, "Private channel," and Friday said it, and Tony went quiet again for longer this time. Steve had come around the overturned bus and was standing in the open street, looking at Saitama from approximately 30 feet away, and doing the thing that Steve did when he encountered something that required recalibration, holding still, observing, letting the new information settle into his understanding of the situation before he tried to act on it. What he was observing was a man in a yellow suit who had just done something that 53 minutes of combined Avengers effort had not come close to doing, and who was currently looking at his own fist with an expression that contained, if Steve was reading it correctly, something that looked uncomfortably like disappointment. Thor descended slowly, landing 20 feet from Saitama with the careful, measured approach of a being who had recalibrated his assessment of the situation and was no longer operating on any of his previous assumptions. He had fought alongside beings of extraordinary power across 9 realms and beyond. He had stood next to the Hulk and felt the ground shake. He had been present when things happened that rewrote his understanding of what was possible. And in all of that experience, across all of that history, he had never felt what he felt standing 20 feet from this man in the yellow suit, which was a specific, pure, unalloyed sense of smallness that had nothing to do with physical size and everything to do with the recognition that he was in the presence of something that existed at a level of capability so far beyond his own that the distance between them was not a matter of degree, but of kind. The way the distance between a candle and the sun is not usefully described as one being brighter than the other. He said, choosing his words with the care of someone who understood that what he said in this moment mattered. That was remarkable. Not effusive, not performative, the straightforward acknowledgement of one warrior to another, the language of genuine respect between people who understood the vocabulary of physical capability and knew when something they had witnessed deserved to be named. Saitama looked at him. Then he looked back in the direction of the parking structure, where the dust was still settling, and where, from within the rubble, something was moving, because Valdris was not done, had not been finished by one punch, was extracting himself from the wreckage with the laborious effort of something that had been hit harder than it had expected and was reassessing but not retreating. And the reassessment was visible in how he moved now, how he oriented himself when he cleared the debris and stood again, how he looked across the 8 blocks between himself and the intersection where Saitama was standing with an attention that was qualitatively different from everything before it, not the mild interest, not the patient tolerance, not the incurious examination of something that had not yet encountered a reason to be fully present. This was something else. This was the look of something that had found, for the first time in 11,000 years, a reason to pay attention. And Saitama, watching Valdris stand up from the ruins of the parking structure and begin moving back toward him, felt something stir in the deep, quiet place where feeling used to live before the training took most of it away. Something small and fragile and stubbornly persistent, like a pilot light that has been burning so low for so long that you've stopped checking whether it's still on, and then one day you reach past it for something and feel the warmth and remember that it was there. He felt it the way you feel the first drops of rain after a drought, not enough yet to call it rain, not enough yet to change anything, but present, real, the suggestion of something that might become something if the conditions continued. He settled his feet. He looked at Valdris coming toward him across 8 blocks of damaged Manhattan, with the unhurried, certain stride of something that was no longer underestimating what it was walking toward. And for the first time since he had left his apartment, since he had put his bowl in the sink and found his shoe under the couch and walked to the crosswalk and waited for the light, for the first time in this entire sequence of events that had begun with a phone call interrupting a cooking show, Saitama's default expression changed. Not into anything dramatic, not into the fierce concentration of a warrior preparing for battle or the cold focus of someone calculating odds. Into something simpler and more honest than either of those things, something that the people watching him from their various positions around the intersection would each describe differently afterward, in their reports and their conversations and the quiet moments when they turned the day over in their minds trying to understand what they had seen. Tony would describe it as focus. Steve would describe it as recognition. Thor, who had the longest vocabulary for this particular territory, would describe it as the expression of a warrior who has heard, for the first time in a long time, a sound that might be worth listening to. Natasha, who described things precisely and without ornamentation, would write in her report that the subject's expression changed in a way that suggested increased engagement with the situation, and leave it at that, because the more specific description, the one that matched what she had actually seen, was one that she couldn't fit into the language of an assessment report without it sounding like something other than a professional document. What she had seen and what she did not write down was that Saitama had smiled. Not widely, not with the uncomplicated joy of someone who is happy. The small, private smile of someone who has been waiting a long time for something and is not yet sure that this is it, but is, for the first time in a long time, genuinely curious about what comes next. There are endings that announce themselves, that build through escalating music and converging narrative threads and the accumulated weight of everything that came before them, until the ending arrives with the satisfying inevitability of a door closing on a room that has been fully explored. And then there are the other kind, the endings that don't announce themselves, that arrive quietly in the middle of something that still looks like it might continue, that happen not with a crescendo but with a single, small, specific moment that contains within it the entirety of what the story was actually about, if you were paying attention to the right things. The ending of this story is the second kind, and it begins not with Saitama's fist but with a question, asked in the rubble of what used to be a parking structure on the west side of Manhattan, by a being that had survived 11,000 years and 3 universal collapses, and had never, in all of that time, encountered a reason to ask it. Valdris came back across those 8 blocks differently than he had moved before. The patience was still there. He was not running, not charging, not doing any of the things that beings do when they have been hurt and are responding from the reactive, animal place that pain produces in most things that can feel it. But the deliberateness had changed in quality, had become something denser and more focused, the deliberateness of something that had updated its model of the situation and was now moving with full awareness of what it was moving toward instead of the partial awareness it had been operating on before. His energy signature, which Friday was monitoring continuously, had shifted. The cycling that Bruce had identified as his damage dispersion mechanism had accelerated back to its baseline rate, which meant he had processed the impact and returned to operational status. But there was something else in the readings now, something layered beneath the baseline cycling that Friday flagged as anomalous and spent 30 seconds trying to categorize before generating a note in her analysis log that said, simply unknown variable, possible emotional or intentional component, no existing framework for assessment. The Avengers had pulled back, not retreated. None of them were built for retreat in any clean psychological sense, but redistributed, moved to positions that were not between Saitama and Valdris, because the last 58 minutes had produced enough evidence for all of them to understand, without requiring a formal discussion, that the space between those two was not theirs to occupy right now. Steve had moved to the north side of the intersection, and he was watching with the full, undivided attention that he reserved for moments that he understood he would need to remember accurately. The kind of attention that takes a mental photograph every few seconds and files it somewhere deep and permanent. Thor was above and slightly west, Mjolnir in hand, but hanging rather than raised, the posture of someone who is present as a witness rather than a participant. Tony had cut his repulsors to minimum hover power, conserving the suit's remaining capacity while maintaining altitude, and he had asked Friday to allocate maximum available processing to the recording and analysis functions, because he had the strong intuition that what was about to happen was something that he would need to spend a very long time understanding, and the more complete the data, the better his chances of eventually getting there. Valdris stopped 12 feet from Saitama. The distance was deliberate, not the half-block assessment distance of their first encounter, and not the striking distance that the approach had seemed to be building toward, but something in between, a chosen distance that had the quality of a decision about the nature of the interaction rather than a position in a fight. He looked at Saitama with the full, undivided attention that he had not given to anything else in this dimension, and the attention had in it, beneath the assessment and the calculation and all the other things that 11,000 years of existence had layered onto the experience of looking at something, the faint, unmistakable quality of recognition. Not the recognition of someone who has seen this person before, but the recognition of someone who has seen this category of thing before. Encountered it somewhere in the long record of everything they have experienced, and is in the process of locating the memory. He spoke again, and this time the sound resolved, for Saitama, into something that was not quite language but carried the structure of a question, an upward inflection at the end, the universal shape of something being asked rather than stated, the form that uncertainty takes when it reaches out toward another consciousness for information it doesn't have. Saitama looked at him for a moment, and then said, in the flat, conversational tone that was his default register for most things, "I don't know what you're saying." He said it without apology, without frustration, the simple factual report of a communication barrier. He looked at Valdris the way he might look at a vending machine that wasn't accepting his change, acknowledging the problem without being particularly distressed by it. Friday, processing the sound in real time, generated a translation at medium confidence and fed it to Tony's HUD, and Tony read it and then said quietly to no one, "Huh." Steve on the comm said, "What?" and Tony said, Friday translated what he said. Medium confidence, but, and Steve said, "What did he say?" and Tony said, "She thinks he asked how." There was a pause on the channel. Thor said, "How what?" and Tony said, "Just how. Not how did you do that, not how are you this strong, just how, like the question is about something bigger than the punch." Another pause. Steve said, "What does that mean?" and Tony said, "I have absolutely no idea." And for once, the admission carried no frustration with it, just the clean, honest acknowledgement of a man who had hit the edge of his framework and was standing at the boundary looking out at territory he didn't have maps for. Saitama, who had not heard any of this, who was not on the comm channel, who was simply standing 12 feet from a being that had asked him something he couldn't hear in a language he couldn't understand, did something that none of the observers had predicted, which was that he sat down, on the street. Cross-legged, on the damaged asphalt of 42nd and 7th, in the middle of what had been a battle and was now something else. He just sat down. The way you sit down when you've been on your feet for a while and there isn't a chair and the floor is available. He looked up at Valdris from this position with the same attentive blankness, and the absurdity of the visual. This enormous, ancient, interdimensional entity that had survived 3 universal collapses, looking down at a bald man in a yellow suit sitting, cross-legged on the ground 12 feet below him, was not lost on anyone present, and produced in each of them a slightly different response that all had somewhere in the vicinity of a common origin, which was the recognition that something was happening here that did not fit the story they had thought they were in. Valdris looked at him sitting there. Then, with a movement so slow and deliberate that it had in it the quality of a choice rather than an action. He lowered himself as well, not to the ground, not cross-legged, but down onto one knee, which brought his eyeline to approximately Saitama's level, which brought the two of them into a kind of accidental equivalence that the geometry of their previous interaction had not contained. He looked at Saitama from this position, and Saitama looked back at him. And for a moment, 10 seconds, maybe 15, the observers would disagree in their accounts. They just looked at each other, two beings at completely opposite ends of every conceivable spectrum of experience and history and scale, sitting in the wreckage of a city block in lower Manhattan on a Tuesday afternoon. And the looking had in it something that none of the instruments could measure and none of the reports would fully capture, which was the specific quality of two things recognizing each other across an enormous distance. Then Saitama scratched the back of his head the way he did when he was trying to find words for something that didn't come with words already attached and said, "I trained every day. 100 push-ups, 100 sit-ups, 100 squats, 10 kilometers running. Did that for about a year and a half, maybe 2 years." He paused. "Lost my hair somewhere in there." Another pause. "And then one day I was just strong, like really strong, too strong kind of." He looked at his hand, the same hand he had been looking at after the first punch with the same searching expression. Everything since then has just been, I don't know, the same. Nothing's a fight anymore. Nothing's hard. Nothing. He stopped. He looked at Valdris. He said quietly with an honesty that had no performance in it, that was just the plain, direct statement of something true, "Nothing makes me feel anything." He wasn't talking to Valdris. Not really. He was talking in the direction of Valdris, in the way that you sometimes speak towards something large and silent, because the large silent thing is easier to be honest with than the people you know, because it has no expectations of you, no prior image of who you're supposed to be, no disappointment available to it. He was talking the way people talk when they finally say the thing they've been not saying, when the accumulated weight of the unsaid reaches a point where the body just releases it, because holding it any longer has become more expensive than letting it go. Valdris listened, or did something that looked like listening. His energy signature, which Friday was still monitoring, did something during those 40 seconds that she would flag in her report as significant but unclassifiable. The cycling slowed again, not to the alarmed deceleration of the first punch's aftermath, but to something that had in it the quality of attention, of a system allocating its resources toward input processing rather than output generation, of something choosing to receive rather than transmit. When Saitama finished talking and went quiet, Valdris was still for a moment. Then he spoke again, longer this time, a sequence of sounds that had the shape of a response, not a challenge, not a declaration, but an answer, the structure of something being offered rather than imposed. Friday caught it and translated it at low confidence, flagging the translation heavily with uncertainty markers. But the directional meaning she extracted and pushed to Tony's HUD was this: that the being called Valdris had not come to this dimension to destroy it, had come instead for something that his own language did not have a precise word for, something that translated approximately as the end of the ability to be changed by things, and that he had been looking for it for 11,000 years, and that he had believed he might find it here, and that he was not sure now whether he had found it in the dimension or in the specific entity currently sitting cross-legged on the ground in front of him. Tony read this 3 times. Then he said on the private channel, "Friday, am I reading this right?" And Friday said, "Low confidence, but yes, I believe the translation indicates that what Valdris came here to find is something like the feeling of being beyond feeling, and he thinks Saitama might already have it." Tony was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So he came here looking for what Saitama already lost?" Friday said, "That appears to be the directional implication, yes." Thor, who had been listening on the channel, said nothing for a long time. When he spoke, it was not on the comm, he said it quietly, to himself in Old Norse, and only Friday caught it, translating it automatically, filing it in the record. What he said was, He has been searching 11,000 years for the thing this man would give anything to undo. Saitama stood up. He brushed some dust off his suit, the automatic, habitual gesture of someone tidying themselves after sitting on the ground, the gesture of the ordinary world reasserting itself through muscle memory. He looked at Valdris, who was still in his one-knee position, still at eye level, still in that accidental equivalence, and he said something that Tony would later describe, in the debrief, as the most unexpectedly affecting thing he had witnessed in a career that had included a genuinely remarkable range of affecting things. He said, in the same flat, conversational tone he used for everything, without drama, without weight, without any of the ornamentation that the moment might have seemed to call for, "If you figure out how to fix it, let me know." And then he put his hands in his pockets and turned, and started walking back toward West 43rd. Valdris watched him go. He stayed on one knee for a moment after Saitama had turned away, watching the yellow suit and the white cape move down the damaged street at the same unhurried pace that it had arrived with, and the expression on his face, if the face of something like Valdris could be said to contain expressions in any way that the word was designed to describe, was one that Friday, in her final report, would flag as unclassifiable by existing emotional taxonomy, and that Thor, the only person present with enough experience of enough different kinds of beings to have a reference point, would describe quietly to Steve later that evening as the expression of something that had arrived at the end of a very long search and found, instead of the answer, a better question. The dimensional rift above the city sealed itself approximately 4 minutes after Saitama turned away. Not dramatically, no implosion, no light show, no event that marked the moment clearly for the people watching it. Simply closed, the way a door closes when the person who opened it has decided to leave, and the sky above Manhattan was ordinary again, and the violet-white shimmer was gone, and what remained was the city damaged, dust-covered, structurally compromised in several areas that were going to require significant reconstruction funding that the city did not currently have, but present, intact in the ways that mattered, still there in the way that cities are still there after the things that happened to them. Because cities, like the people who build them, have a stubborn, unreasonable, completely unjustifiable tendency to continue. Tony landed on the street and stood there for a moment with his helmet up, looking in the direction that Saitama had walked, and then looking at the space where Valdris had been, and then back again, processing the sequence of events through every analytical framework he had available to him and arriving, each time, at the same conclusion, which was that the framework was insufficient and that building a better one was going to take time he didn't currently have and possibly more humility than he was used to deploying in a single sitting. He said to Steve, who had walked up beside him, "So what just happened?" And Steve said, "I'm not entirely sure." And Tony said, "That makes 2 of us." And Steve said, "I think that might be the most honest either of us has been today." And Tony, after a moment, said, "Yeah, probably." Saitama got home at 6:47, which was later than he had planned because the walk back had taken him past the grocery store, and the canned salmon was on sale, not a temporary markdown, but a proper sale, 30% off, which met his threshold. He bought 4 cans. He put them in his bag next to the cereal he had bought earlier, and he climbed the stairs to apartment 4C, and he unlocked the door and he went inside, and he put his cape on the hook by the door where it lived, and he went to the kitchen, and he put the canned salmon in the cabinet, and he put the cereal next to the other cereal, and he stood in his kitchen for a moment in the quiet of his apartment, and he thought about the question that Valdris had asked him, the one he couldn't hear. The one that Friday had translated at low confidence as just the single word "how," and he thought about whether he had an answer to it, and he thought about the fact that he had been asking himself the same question, in different language, for longer than he wanted to count. He didn't have an answer, he had known he wouldn't. He went and sat on his floor in front of the television and turned it on, and the cooking show was in reruns, and the man from Osaka was presenting his broth in the quarterfinal. the episode before the one Saitama had watched today. And Saitama watched it. And somewhere in the watching, in the small, ordinary ritual of following a story he already knew the ending of, in the comfortable certainty of an outcome he had already seen resolve correctly. He felt the faint warmth of the pilot light that had stirred earlier, still there, still burning at its low and stubborn level, and he thought that maybe that was enough for tonight. Maybe that was enough. Outside, the city was beginning the long, complicated process of figuring out what had just happened to it. Tony Stark was in his workshop with every piece of data from the day, building new frameworks. Thor was sitting on a rooftop somewhere, looking at the sky where the rift had been, thinking thoughts that would take him several days to finish thinking. Steve Rogers was writing, in the cramped, precise handwriting of a man who learned it before keyboards existed, the report that would become the strangest document in SHIELD's operational history. The account of the day that Earth's mightiest heroes needed saving, and the man who saved them had waited for the walk signal, and asked to be excused so he could watch a cooking show. And the villain had left not because he was defeated, but because he had found something more interesting than destroying a world. Which was the fact that somewhere in it, on a Tuesday, in apartment 4C on West 43rd Street, there was a man sitting on the floor eating instant noodles who had already found the thing he had spent 11,000 years searching for, and had not wanted it, and could not give it back, and kept showing up anyway. That was the whole story. That was all of it. Not a story about power, though power was in it. Not a story about heroism, though heroism was in it too, wearing work boots and waiting for crosswalk signals, and answering the phone on the fifth ring when someone needed something and it wasn't even his shift. A story about what it costs to be beyond challenge, and what it means to keep going anyway, and the strange, specific dignity of a man who has lost the ability to feel the weight of what he carries and carries it regardless, every day, in a yellow suit, to the grocery store and back, on a planet that doesn't know his name and wouldn't know what to do with it if they did. Saitama watched the cooking show. The man from Osaka made his broth. The pilot light burned. The city went on.